to Taxonomy Inside and Outside of Drupal, kicking off day 2 of this lovely MidCamp 2017 with beautiful weather outside that will probably prevent any of you from focusing on anything I'm saying. I will do my best to be interesting. My name is Rob Huffstedtler, and I work for ICF Olson. I'm the technical director of our open solutions group there. And since this was a taxonomy presentation, I thought it might be interesting to pull some facets from a couple of taxonomies and describe myself according to them. So I am, as you might have guessed, a Homo sapiens. My occupation, as I said, is technical director. My Myers-Briggs type is INFP, but I can fake E with the best of them. These last 4 dimensions come from the Scottish census in 2011. I am not Scottish, but I've been there. My English spoken, very well. You may disagree by the end of this. My Gaelic skills, no skills in Gaelic. Distance traveled to work, most every day I am at home. We have a somewhat distributed workforce. And my general health is very good, although after the way I ate yesterday, that may be changing. Where do we start off here? For most people doing things in Drupal, where they start is going to the structure menu, clicking the taxonomy link. This is not your first step, except in very particular cases where you're doing nothing more than just a list that you need to manage so that you can put it in a drop-down or another selector. Instead, there's a process to get to a well-designed taxonomy. We should first ask, what is a taxonomy? Anybody want to throw out an answer? Groupings. That's a good answer. Categories.
A hierarchical classification system.
You saw my other slide, or you're a librarian. What is a taxonomy? That's classified information. I stole that joke from Heather Hedden, by the way. Obligatory warning. This is a lot of this is 101 level material, and we're doing it in 45 minutes. So this presentation is going to contain gross generalizations and dramatic oversimplifications of very fun, exciting, and complex topics. So before you go off from this and classify the world, you might want to consult your own taxonomist. The definition of taxonomy that we're going to use for digital experience management is this. It is a classification of content, specifically, into a structure with one or more facets, also known as vocabularies, attributes, dimensions, etc. And each one of those facets may, but not necessarily, be arranged in a hierarchy and may offer a controlled set of terms for describing the content. It's also possible to make it open. Practical example from the real world of digital experience management. I stole these categories from Kohl's.com, just because I figure at some point in your life, every one of you has bought some article of clothing online. So we've got a kind of common pool of experience here. So when you go to buy a shirt at Kohl's, they have like 16 different facets, but some of the common ones that you're going to see elsewhere, color, size, and material. Those are all sort of descriptive attributes. Your shirt might be black, blue, whatever. They also have, what I found interesting, a facet for occasion, when you might wear this article of clothing. And that is a true classification kind of facet, because you're making a judgment about it. You're not just observing something, you're bringing some experience or knowledge or context to it that says this is the right occasion for this. See if they had my favorite there. I lost my favorite one. They had one down the list that was extremely weird, but you can get your Christmas shirt here if you want, or your bridal shirt. It's very versatile. You can sometimes use the same for both. There are industries that have standard taxonomies. Some of the most famous are MESH, which is the medical subject headings, NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System. So wherever you work, there's a numerical code that identifies the industry you're in. We have actually used that for content tailoring at one of our clients where they had specific vertical industry solutions, And there's a company out there called Demandbase that will, by IP, correlate you to a NAICS code. So if you were in the medical industry versus the professional services industry, we could feature different content for you. XBRL, it's various taxonomies for financial reporting. If you've ever used the SEC's Edgar tool for looking at financial reports from companies in sort of a normalized, structured fashion, very handy. Probably not something any of us would want to work with normally. Library of Congress subject headings, the successor to the Dewey Decimal System. And then the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities, which I've already forgotten what that one is. Point being, in some cases, you will have the option of just taking a taxonomy that's either licensed or freely available and applying it to your particular organizational problem. For a lot of us, though, we're starting from scratch and having to think, what is a taxonomy that is going to work for describing and classifying my content? How is a taxonomy useful? If I had a taxonomy, what are some things that I could do with it? Well, let's take a step back and get a little bit conceptual here. I like to have theory that underlies the things I do. Even though I'm a little bit pragmatic, I like to know if there's some sort of knowledge base that puts practice in an overall context that has been validated by the experience of other folks. And one of the things I like to point out to people in our technology industry is we have this sort of chronological bias. We think we're doing cool stuff that nobody has ever done before, and we're full of crap. So way back in 1931, the big thing in digital experience management over the last, I would say, 5 years at this point, still something of an unrealized dream, is personalization. That you should be able to get the stuff you want when you want it. And we're like, nobody's ever been able to do this before, except for this dude named S.R. Ranganathan, known as the father of library science. Way back in 1931, Ranganathan proposed these 5 laws of library science that were, as you might imagine, sort of centered around physical libraries. Number 1, books are for use. Like in a library, our goal is not just to stick them on a shelf and classify them. They're actually intended for somebody to find them and derive value from them. Every reader has his or her book. You have a particular set of interests or needs. I have a particular set of interests or needs. They don't necessarily overlap. Every book has its reader. So for everything that an author puts time into crafting, there's some intended audience or audiences. And you need to find the intersection of those for the library to be useful. One of Ranganathan's biggest things that he proposed that was kind of paradigm changing for libraries is the goal of the library is to save the time of the reader. The whole idea is to connect the reader to the resource they want as quickly as possible. And the library is a growing organism. We're assuming that our collection is going to be expanding over time. Some things are going to be going out the back as they become obsolete or worn out or whatever, but there's always new content being created. I would propose, back in 2016, the dark ages of the internet, things were totally different back then, I propose that with a few minor substitutions and one addition, Ranganathan's laws become applicable to everything we're trying to do in digital experience management. First, content is for use. We're no longer just thinking about books, we're thinking about blogs, videos, tweets, any way that we might communicate with one another. Every person has his or her content. I really struggled over this word. Ranganathan, working in a library context, was able to think purely about readers. I was thinking, well, reader doesn't work because sometimes we're not reading, sometimes we're viewing. So I thought, well, do we call it a visitor? Well, we can't call it a visitor because that presumes this modality of I'm interacting with a web page. As we're moving into a world where more content is pushed, that's no longer really a valid way of looking at things. And that said, user. Well, to me, user still implies initiation on the part of the human interactor. And actually, in the future, we could be looking at situations where in the semantic web, applications interact directly with no human involved at all. So in the end, I went with person, which as you can see doesn't quite work. If one of you guys comes up with a better word, let me know, and it'll make it into the next version of this. Every content has its person. Every content has its time. This is my addition. The thing that we have the capability to do now that Ranganathan did not have the capability of doing is to begin to customize the experiences based upon the actual context and life of the user at that time. There are things I might be interested in at 9 o'clock in the morning that I'm not going to be interested in at 9 o'clock at night. Good example, like if you were to push me a restaurant recommendation right at 11:25 today, I would probably be really excited. If you were to push me a restaurant recommendation at 3:25 this morning, I would have been very not excited. Save the time of the person, that stays basically the same. And the content pool now, rather than think about it as a library, the set of stuff out there is a growing organism. And potentially, I'm ad-libbing some of this because new ideas are coming to me as I speak. One of the differences, Ranganathan's library was a building that housed resources internally. And he had access through interlibrary loan or whatever the equivalent was in 1931. You could know that resources existed elsewhere and point people to them. Now we live in a world where resources are being created as fast as we can index them or faster. And I don't necessarily care that content exists just within my organization. For certain use cases, I may want to be able to point people outside my organization into the wider world. Taxonomy enables at least 3, potentially more, but at least 3 use cases, general use cases within the digital experience world. The first, kind of the oldest and most obvious, browsing. I want to be able to structure my content in one or more hierarchies that are going to allow a person to say, a good example of what we did for Belize. So there are 2 kinds of travelers. There are those who know where they want to go, but they don't know what they're going to do once they get there. And there are those who know what they want to do, but they don't necessarily know the best places to do that thing. So Belize, for instance, attracts a lot of scuba divers. So you might want to begin your search by browsing all the places where I can do scuba diving. On the other hand, you might be more like me. When I visited, I knew we wanted to go to a particular region of the country, and I was like, what can we do once we get there? So the advantage of a digital world as opposed to a physical world is it becomes much easier to switch our view of things. The same pool, we could overlay a totally different classification for different use cases. Second, faceted search. So everybody's experienced this on eBay and elsewhere. It's kind of become the default way, I would say, of filtering down a large pool of potentially interesting stuff. And then content tailoring, also sometimes called targeting. I have this whole diatribe I go off on how I think targeting is a very unfriendly term, and we need to be thinking about how we serve our user rather than how we exploit them, but we don't have time for that. Point being, super simple example, this time of year right now, if I'm in Chicago this week, especially yesterday, and I go to an e-commerce site, I'm much more likely to buy that coat than I am to buy those board shorts, unless I'm going on a trip. So our ability to tailor depends a lot on how much we can know about the user. That's a separate conversation. There are probably other use cases I haven't thought of. If you think of them, please let me know. So moving on to, we can do stuff with this. How do we get to a taxonomy that we can use for it? This is the general approach that we use, super simplified. When I do a kickoff with clients, this slide actually expands into about an hour-long presentation where we talk very specifically about all the steps that go into this. But at a high-level, rough overview perspective, you're going to start with content sampling and analysis. That is, you're going to take some number of pieces of content that you hope are representative of the overall content. And you're going to begin to say what are potentially interesting ways that we might classify this And you're going to say, given these potentially interesting classifications, what are some terms that are likely to be used enough that they would be worthwhile for beginning to search and filter and browse this content. After that, we're going to need a series of work sessions. We're probably going to discover if it's a field that we're not intimately familiar with, there are going to be things where we need business people to clarify for us, what does this term even mean in your world? How do your users use this term? And so, caveat there. Anytime you're dealing with any organization on Earth, chances are they're somewhat narcissistic. Not intentionally so, but all of us, when we get together, we develop our own ways of talking. If you've spent any time with Drupal people, you know this is true. Like, we try and communicate with developers in other worlds, and they're like, the way you use the word view confuses the heck out of me. So be informed by what business stakeholders tell you, but at the same time kind of take it with a grain of salt, because whose opinion matters the most? Actual question, not a rhetorical.
The end user?
The end user, exactly. If you describe something one way, and there was a home improvement retailer that we worked with, very large one, and they never could decide on what to call that level of things, the different kinds of things you could buy in store. And they ultimately settled on categories. And you even see this when you go in the store, sometimes there's signs. Installation across 19 categories. I'm like, I don't know what word would be a better word to use for that, but nobody goes into a store thinking, I need a category of stuff. All right, and then draft out a taxonomy and begin to do card sorts with it. They're optional, but you want to make sure that people can, that the actual end users might group things the way you group them. Review that with the business users, do some test tagging of content. Critical thing here, have actual people who are likely to be authoring or classifying the content do it. And then see if it matches up to what you expected. If one of the places where things go very badly awry, and it's one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of open taxonomies, is if the person who's authoring is often in a time crunch, and they're going to tend to not put a lot of good effort into it. If it requires a lot of training to use your taxonomy, if the choices are not kind of obvious, you're going to get a low quality of tagging. There's automated solutions that can help with that, but automated solutions tend to get you at best to about 70-80% usefulness rate, which may be better than poorly trained human taggers. But they also tend to work better if you have huge corpuses of content. If you've got 3,000 or 4,000 things, you're not even going to be able to afford them. And make your revisions. Lastly, educate your authors and begin tagging content so you can deploy it. Some challenges. Going back to those slides, deep dive on some of them. How much content do I actually need to look at? Enough is the answer. It's a little bit more an art than a science. And I've talked to statistics PhDs, librarians, various kinds of social science researchers, and I have not gotten an answer that satisfies me yet as to exactly how much content to look at. As a practical matter, I employ 4 rules. First, more is better. If you can afford to look at everything, that would be great. You probably can't. The smaller your corpus of content is, the bigger percentage of it you need to look at to make sure that you're getting a representative sample. When you find that you're going through large sections of content and you're not learning anything new, you're probably reaching a saturation point. But you need to be, in order for that to work, you need to look at it in a random fashion. If you just start with one thing and you go siloed, you're very quickly going to saturate because your sample is not representative. And lastly, how complete your taxonomy needs to be is entirely dependent on the cost of having missed a term. If it's just that one page out of a million pages potentially doesn't surface in a search, but other things that are satisfying the user do, no big deal. If something, on the other hand, is critical information that people need to find and it is poorly classified, that's a problem. Classification depends on the user. Remember, back to every book has its reader. So here we have 3 common bits of plumbing supplies. And if you're a plumber, you're going to call the first one a supply line, the second one a pop-up assembly, and the third one a P-trap. If you are my teenage daughters, you're going to call, whoops, it's not there yet. If you're my teenage daughters, you're going to call this a hose thingy, that's a drain thingy, and that's also a drain thingy. Classification depends on use case. Which one of these is a fish?
On the left.
They're all fish. And I think we can all agree on the first one. We don't need to elaborate on that. But if I'm running to the pet store and I'm saying fish, I'm probably looking for something very much like that. If I'm a 16th century Flemish painter and I'm wanting to depict the story of the biblical prophet Jonah being swallowed by the big fish, I'm probably going to paint something that looks a little bit more like that orca there, which we'd be like, dude, that's a mammal. 16th century Flemish painter doesn't care that it's a mammal. It's big, it has teeth, it lives in the water. Fun fact though, if you really like to geek out on this stuff, there was a paper titled When Whales Became Mammals, written by Aldemaro Romero. It covers the history of the classification of whales all the way from Aristotle up to Linnaeus. Great way to spend an afternoon when it's raining. Not today. But let's say I'm an 18th century Spanish missionary in Venezuela. I've got a bunch of converts from the population. They like eating capybara. They like eating capybara a lot. I'm not sure why. I've never tasted it. I've had gibnut, which is a Belizean thing that kind of looks similar, and it was pretty tasty. So maybe I'll give capybara a try someday. But capybaras spend most of their time in the water, even though they're rodents. So Lent's coming up, and these missionaries write to the Vatican, and they say, hey, here's what the locals eat. It spends a lot of time in the water. Can we call it a fish? And the Vatican wrote back and said, it's a fish. So now you know. Classification depends on use case. Then we've got the question of how should I organize my vocabularies. And those of you who have really good vision will notice that these are both actually navigational taxonomies. So it's more the how do I design my sitemap, but the exact same organizational principles apply for any kind of taxonomy, and consequently you can use the same sorts of tools. You need to figure out whether you need totally separate facets or whether you can have a hierarchy within a single facet that covers things. And this is, again, more art than science. Back to the home improvement retailer, one of the things that they debated a lot was this notion of indoor spaces versus outdoor spaces. Do people think of those as distinct kinds of concepts? And they decided that they did. But then it led to this interesting conversation of your garage. Is it an indoor space or an outdoor space? By show of hands, who says it's an indoor space? And who says it's an outdoor space? That was exactly what we discovered across everybody we surveyed. It was like almost 50-50 whether a garage is an indoor space or an outdoor space. It might be interesting if we had time to explore to see if those of you who divide into different camps use your garage differently. I don't know if that would make a difference. But who here has done a card sort before? Okay, a fair number of you. Enough people haven't that I'll explain it. So when you're doing a card sort, you can either, you want to do only one level of a taxonomy at a time and group it into groupings. But you can start out with individual terms written on cards, and you hand them to your user and say, organize these into related piles and give them a title for that pile. You also can give them blank cards if they feel like they don't have a grouping that works for them. You can do those online or in person. Optimal Sort is probably the most popular online card sorting tool. And we talked about open versus closed already. A couple of book recommendations. Everything is Miscellaneous. This one, again, it's a little bit more conceptual. It's more of an entertaining read as opposed to something that you'll directly apply anything from. But Weinberger goes through the whole history of trying to classify things and how philosophically for large stretches of time, there was this idea that we can come to one proper classification that's representative of the true structure of the world. He would argue instead that we really kind of bring our own order to the disorder, hence everything is miscellaneous. And then The Accidental Taxonomist, I was so excited to see this book get re-released last year because all of her examples were like really dated and had URLs that didn't work anymore, but the material was so good. It's brand new, it's up to date. You owe it to yourself to get a copy. Moving on to Drupal. Taxonomies are awesome in Drupal. We use them for everything, probably even stuff we shouldn't. But I would argue that the average Drupaler does not use them to the full extent they're capable. What I see people use taxonomies for is basically, I need a list, the site builder needs to be able to control what's in that list. Or maybe a power user who only has access to change the taxonomies, and I'm going to use it to drive drop-downs or whatever, which is cool. I mean, that's awesome. It's fun. So much less than what you can do. Taxonomies are entities in Drupal, which is awesome because that means they're fieldable. So you can begin attaching things like images to them. You can relate them to other taxonomies. You can put descriptions on them. You can have those whole term pages and vocabulary pages that you get out of the box. Note, by the way, my slides for the most part are still showing D7 interface because it didn't change enough between D7 and D8 to make it worth me updating most of the slides. Taxonomies can be used with Path Auto. Really critical if you want to have worthwhile URLs for people instead of node/23456. Taxonomies. What was the difference there? Oh, yeah. So here you see after I've generated my all my paths based on the rules that I put in. I'm assuming most of you know how to do that. If you don't and you want to know, see me after and we'll play with it. Taxonomy Manager is a module that makes it even better. The thing that's frustrating about taxonomies in Drupal, the primary thing that's frustrating to me is the user interface for managing large sets of terms. No good way to import them out of the box. Deleting a term individually, click, 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 that gets old. Taxonomy Manager gives you a nice tree interface where you can move things from vocabulary to vocabulary. You can reorder them easily. You can do mass imports. It's easier to search for a term. So all kinds of cool stuff. If you have a taxonomy that has more than 30 or 40 terms, you really ought to take a look at this. We have one on a project right now that has 32,000 terms. And it's a little bit more of that typical Drupal case. It's not for classifying anything. It's for relating billing codes to devices. The D8 version is not quite ready for prime time yet. It still throws a very ugly error on the main settings page for it. I intended to write a patch for that and submit it, but I got busy. Site builders can do almost all taxonomy tasks, so you don't need a developer for creating a new vocabulary, adding fields, simple updates to the display of term listing pages, making taxonomies available to other entity types. All this stuff in most of the other systems I work with is a giant pain in the rear, but in Drupal it's like magic. Other things to check out. A couple of modules. The Synonyms module is now in alpha for D8. Those of you who've dealt with real formal taxonomies know one of the handiest things is sometimes you've got a bunch of sort of loosely related terms and you want to say this is the official term, automobile versus car, for instance. But you need a way then when a user searches for car, whether it's a user who's tagging or a user who's using, that you can say, oh, you actually mean this other thing. So Synonyms does that. Term Reference Tree provides you with a much better widget for browsing large taxonomies. I think the thing that's still missing, I'll hit that in a second. Oh, I took that slide out. Never mind the thing I took out. So when should I use, this is like the meat of this, right? This is what everybody actually came here for. I have to make a decision as a site builder. I've got a thing where I need a list of stuff. Should I make it a select list? Should I make it a term reference? Or should I make it some other kind of entity reference? The general heuristic I follow: make it a select list if the options are relatively static and it's okay to wait until you have a release or a maintenance window or whatever your particular software development lifecycle is before you change it. And there's no need to ever look at an item by itself. So if color were an example here, you're never going to look at red. Term reference. So this is where we're landing for the most part today. If authors and visitors need to update options, it's the way you want to go. If terms need associated fields, so we want to add a description for what a term means, or we want to have an associated icon that goes with things that use that term. Or if there is a use case for an individual item view. If we were tagging things by location and then we wanted to see all of the restaurants that are within Illinois or something, great use case for that. Other entity references, almost everything's an entity now in D8. It's awesome, but users and nodes are probably the biggest things. If there's something that really has an individual identity, Nick, we wouldn't make Nick a taxonomy term. We would make Nick an actual human being, but we might relate him to content he owns or places he lives or whatever it might be. Questions, and we have a goal here. We have a goal. We want to be this kid. This kid is awesome. He's engaged. He's happy to be here. This kid, he's waiting for lunch. So, questions?
I don't have a question, but just a further suggestion on when to use taxonomy. Another use case I found where taxonomy is much handier than just a list item is if you have different content types using the same taxonomy and you need to establish a views relationship between those content types based on that
So basically a many-to-many relationship between two other entities?
Yes.
Yeah, I can see that working. You had something, Chris, and then Nick?
So
He wore a
perhaps
suit, man.
Slightly different question you wanted, but who owns taxonomy in your private team structure? Whose responsibility is that?
The resource for it. So in an ideal world, you would have actual taxonomists who were trained and had library science backgrounds and whatnot. And the reality, none of us, unless you're working for a library, does enough volume of taxonomy-based stuff for that to work. So it ends up depending a little bit on use case. All of our BAs have done some taxonomy work. I think within the Drupal world, that's a discipline that we tend not to invest in the way we should. Business analysis we're kind of weak on, and we make either the project manager do it or the tech guy. Being the tech guy and being kind of nerdy, I often end up doing it. Content strategists, if you have them, and if they're like doing actual real content strategy and not just like some IA who decided that being an IA was no longer the cool term, so now he's a content strategist. Those folks can be very good at this if they invest in like actually learning how to do it. Nick.
I've tried it both ways where using the actual taxonomy system in Drupal versus just using content types and entity references. Is there a strong reason to use taxonomies over just doing normal references, to basically treating a content type as your taxonomy and just doing entity references to it?
I think it really comes down to that idea of, are you going to use any of the out-of-the-box taxonomy stuff? Like you get the term page and you get the vocabulary page, and you can do some theming with those, and sometimes that will get you 80% of where you need to go on some of your listing pages versus having to craft a view that does that stuff. So that would be one of the things I would look at. If any of these kind of helper modules are useful for you, that would steer me towards taxonomy. But I think for me, it fundamentally, just at a philosophical level, comes down to, is this thing an abstract concept that groups things, or does it have its own independent existence? Also, is it going to have more than one? How many terms are you going to apply to a thing, too? If you're multiple classification, that to me implies taxonomy rather than single select term, might lean more towards this thing has an independent existence. Anyone else?
I'd also like to say that term tree module that you mentioned is a godsend for taxonomies with a lot of hierarchy to them. I mean, the end user widget is so much more friendly than trying for them to drill down into a big hierarchy. I've used it with a lot of success.
What would you say is the largest taxonomy you've worked with, both in terms of number of terms and depth?
Well, I think the biggest project was when we were trying to do curriculum mapping online for our school district, and it all involved relating things to Common Core standards. And if you've ever seen the Common Core, it's a hierarchical structure that goes actually kind of deep.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say it's probably about 5 levels deep and maybe 500 to 1,000 terms. Something like that.
Wow. In general, what would you guys like? Anybody have a taxonomy bigger than that they've dealt with in terms of depth? Okay. In practice, especially like in the e-commerce world, like eBay goes about as deep as I would ever go. I mean, would you disagree with that, Chris? You're the e-commerce expert in the room.
That what goes on deep?
For e-commerce, like you're going to have a somewhat deeper taxonomy there than you would in other cases, but you still don't want to go super deep.
I think his curriculum examples I could see that. That's not an e-commerce example, but departments, sub-departments, classes, I think that would rival a larger e-commerce center as well.
No.
Maybe not Amazon, but
What we've seen in e-commerce is their users think in terms of categories only at a rough level. You know, clothing, men's or women's clothing, and that's about as much as they refine to a category. And then from there, they think about just different attributes within the category. So that's where you're going to start thinking about color and occasion and size and whatnot.
I have a question about the North American Industrial Classification System. I've used the SI standard as a classification, SIC and
Yep.
NAICS for finding businesses of a certain type. Well, and the NAICS has a further breakdown. It could be more refined. What was the cause of them starting that? Do you know the history of how that?
I don't actually know. I know that SIC codes were much more widely. I may be getting this backwards. I think SIC codes were more widely used globally, but they're not as refined. And everybody's pushing for NAICS, but outside of the U.S., your chances of getting an accurate classification from a database to a NAICS code is not as high. But for most of our purposes, I love it when I make these like grandiose statements because there's always somebody who's like, no, you're wrong about this. I would assume that for most of the purposes of the people in this room, if you were dealing with something that was industry specific, you're only going to refine down to the level of like manufacturing or maybe process manufacturing versus discrete manufacturing or restaurant or whatever. You're not going to want to get down to manufacturer of aerosol gels for the aviation industry.
Well, actually, I work with small business, and I do want to get down.
Okay.
For example, I've done consulting to interior design firms. I can find interior design firms in NAICS, but not in SIC code. In SIC code, you get home improvement stores, paint stores, furniture stores. But NAICS, you can get interior design firms. And that's exactly who they are.
Okay. And is your use case, are you doing that for something you're building, or is that purely for your marketing purposes?
I'm an IT consultant, I'm a web designer, and I started out doing it for clients who were looking for prospects by region, by area, and go out and make calls. And I started to do a number of interior design firms. I wasn't an expert in it, but once I did 4 or 5, I started to see patterns, and let me see what's here. And so I started to go in and find it, and so now I use it for myself with a database called Reference USA, which is at libraries, and it's free. It's part of the info group. There's an Info USA thing you can buy. So that's what I use it for.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Where I thought you might be going with it was for inbound, because this has been the case in my clients. And if you're going inbound, the challenge you have with classification, the more granular you get, the more content you have to create, right? If I'm going to treat you differently if you're a manufacturer of one thing versus another thing, it's easy to come up with kind of generic manufacturing content. It's much harder to come up with something that applies to somebody who makes floor coatings versus somebody who makes aerosol gels.
Well, one interesting thing about it, which is got nothing to do with Drupal, designing websites, one of the things I want to do is figure out the target market segments that the client is trying to reach. We want to find the website and request a quote or buy a product. So I want to do some research. Who are the types of companies? And then when I do get results, I want to check to see who these people are, to see if they are the target market segment. And what I've discovered, which is quite amazing, is you go into Reference USA and check a company that says a certain type of business, and then they tell you 10 competitors near them. And when I showed that to a couple of clients, they were astounded. They just were quite excited about it. So, and I recently found that you can do a search. This is not a taxonomy. You can do a search for a region or a metro or a zip code or something, and look for companies that did not have a website.
All right. Yeah, that's sounds like you. I think I hear a desire to automate a lot of the market research process that I find to be a giant pain in the rear. So when you're done, let me know and I'll buy it from you.
Well, it's free.
Okay.
I mean, using this thing, it's initially, you go back a few years, I hate to do this, but initially they came on CD-ROMs, and originally people would buy directories of companies like directories of manufacturers, and they were selling things, and they put these big books every 6 months. Then they got on CD-ROMs, and you could buy all the manufacturers in Illinois on a CD-ROM. One of my clients did. And then they started to put it online when the web came out, and then they made a library version. They relabeled it Reference USA. They sold it to libraries, and the difference is you can use it for free. If you do a search and you say, I want to find all the interior design firms in Chicago Metro, I would get 1,500 names coming up, and you can look at 25 at a time, and you want to save, go through and save that data, you can only save 50 records at a time. So if you're looking for a sample of companies and you want 20,000 records for a mailing, you can't get that in the library.
Gotcha.
You're there for 5 days. But if you just want 100 or 50, you can do it pretty easily.
Huh.
And then they've gotten better at it, and they now market this thing, and they put on periodic seminars in the Chicago area for people to use their Reference USA at the library. And the info group is doing this, so people who are using it will ask the library to buy more services from this company. So when I first found that out, which was about 8 or 9 years ago, I was quite amazed that you could get this for free at the library.
We're basically at time, but you quickly, then you quickly.
I just was going to ask you to go back one slide where you had your 3 general use cases, and then possibly go into more detail of uses that you have had on other entity references, maybe some unusual circumstances that you've done crazy things.
Okay, let's take that one offline, and if Chris was here, I'd point you to him and have him, other Chris. Big Chris. I would have, I would tell you about some of the stuff we did at Belize, but we can catch that going later. And then you?
Yeah, what are your feelings on the Taxonomy Access Control Lite module in Drupal 8?
I don't have feelings on it. I did see a presentation at Florida Drupal Camp where they were using it combined with the new profile module and some other stuff for this big content library they did for IBM. And it was pretty fascinating. I haven't had that use case, so I haven't ever played with it.
Okay.
All right, we're out of time. I just clapped for myself.